Dean Thomas. I might misremember the situation of buying my house in Florida, but I feel like before I could close, I was required to buy flood insurance. And so do some states, is that a state difference that because I was in a 100-year floodplain, I had to buy flood insurance in Florida before I could close? Or
it typically is a requirement of the funder, right? So if you buy a house, you almost always have to have a loan. And the lender is more exposed than you are, right? Because if you put 10 or 20% down, the lender has 80 to 90% exposure. So if the flood comes and wipes you out, you say, I'm done, I'm bankrupt, goodbye. The lender takes the huge hit. So it's the lenders that are requiring, they also require you to get homeowners insurance. So I got a letter from my bank recently saying, we're going to buy insurance for you because your insurance has lapsed. I had changed agents. And so there was a mess up in the communication, so they thought I didn't have insurance when I did have insurance. But the lender has the right under the loan documents to go out and buy insurance. And they're not going to insure my stuff, they're just going to insure their stuff. And it's going to be expensive. And not too surprisingly, they're going to buy it from some subsidiary and basically buy it from themselves. Right? So it's a requirement of the lender.
So for residents of the Ninth Ward, people that didn't have flood insurance, it was not a requirement of their lender, or what the circumstances of their buying their homes were different? Or how does that?
I think what happens is that unless the lender is really attuned to flood risk, they find the homeowner's policy to be sufficient. You have to have homeowner's insurance. That will cover most risks, but it doesn't cover the flood risk. The disasters actually heighten people's awareness about some of these issues, and so it changes the pattern of behavior a little bit afterwards, although it tends to go back to normal after a few years. So my best guess is that the lenders require homeowners insurance, but they don't require flood insurance. The other wrinkle to this is that there's actually less lending going on in these communities than what those of us who live in the suburbs are accustomed to, right? So everybody on my street has a loan, but in poor neighborhoods where the house has been paid off and it's sort of delegated to children, the family's been in the home for a long time, the houses are sometimes owned outright. And so there isn't the same kind of dynamic of the lender being involved.
I just wanted to add about Florida. It's an unusual case because Florida has, since Andrew and actually Hugo, I think, that was in South Carolina, began that, this idea of, it has a state insurance pool, so there's private insurers that have been out of Florida for a long time because of all the...
Well, there's a state pool for flood insurance.
Right.
There's a state pool for homeowners insurance, but there's still private homeowners insurance as well.
Oh, there is, okay. But I know there is a whole, Florida is very different.
Right. And these solutions raise some interesting questions about some of my narratives. So one way to fix this is tell people, you've got to buy insurance. Right? It's just crazy not to have insurance. We require you to have insurance. Well, that runs counter to our autonomy narrative, right? And in fact, we just don't obey it. So we've had that rule for autos since the 1950s. Every state requires insurance. Right? Yet, 14% nationally, 25% in some states don't have insurance. And so what's the insurance company's reaction to that? We'll sell you insurance for uninsured motorists. Right? So I have uninsured and underinsured motorist insurance to protect me when somebody who's supposed to have insurance by law doesn't have insurance. Now, another wrinkle to this, and this is also a partial answer to your question about flooding, what people do is they get the required insurance and then they let it lapse. And so they don't keep the insurance. So that's what happens with cars. When you register, you have to prove that you have insurance. You just stop paying the premiums, you get canceled, you save your money, you still have your registration, and you just go for the rest of the year, right, until you have to renew again, and then you renew by mail, maybe you get by without proving that you have insurance. So with flood insurance, you may have to get it when you get your loan, but you stop paying the flood premium and it goes away. The bank may not learn about it. Right? Because it's separately tracked. Part of the difficulty here is that you have homeowners insurance, and then this little piece of flood insurance that's added on as a separate kind of insurance. So it's harder to keep track of. There's this proposal that Nationwide is pushing in Congress to combine them together and still have federal flood insurance, but wrap it into a homeowner's policy as a way of avoiding that duplication problem. It creates some other issues, but maybe would answer them. So my point is that there's this narrative of autonomy that conflicts with one of the solutions, which is tell people, by golly, you better have insurance.
Isn't part of the problem, too, with Katrina that some people thought they had flood insurance covered by virtue of having hurricane insurance, but it was really just wind damage?
Yes.
Is that my...
Yeah, I mean, that's the typical case with homeowners, right? Homeowners insurance covers you against tornadoes and hurricanes and rain damage, and it covers you against wind damage, but it doesn't cover you against flood damage. And so there was this factual question, is this a flood, is this wind? And there's this interface between the exclusion and the coverage, and that's where you had all the litigation. And as I say, it's pretty well established, and it didn't go anywhere.
So somebody ruled somewhere that a hurricane is not a flood.
They ruled that the flood exclusion was clear and enforceable, and that hurricane, the actual terminology of the policy is windstorm or hail. It doesn't actually use the term hurricane, but it talks about windstorms, it talks about hail, it talks about rain, and then it says flooding is excluded, and flooding is defined in the policy to mean tidal waters, surface waters. It's fairly clear. It's not just, and the courts have ruled that way. There was a big test case in Mississippi, and there was a case in Florida, and the courts have ruled for the insurers. And there's a big body of case law that pretty much supports the insurers over time. There's somebody in the back.
Yeah, maybe I missed this from your presentation. I apologize if that's the case. But is there an issue of affordability with flood insurance as well? I mean, in these areas, I don't know what if it's a 100-year floodplain or a 500-year floodplain, but it seems fairly likely that at some point, this is going to happen. So is it to the federal government? Is it affordable for everyone, or how does that work?
Yeah, I tried to get good data, and because it's a government program, they haven't collected data very well. So I don't have very good data. What I do know is that it is subsidized. And so the actuarially sound price is not what's charged. Because the government doesn't have market incentives, right? If they lose money, they go to Congress and ask for more. They don't go out of business. And so so it's very political, the pricing. But it's very clear that flood insurance is about 50% subsidized. So you're paying about half of what you'd pay if you bought it from a private insurer. But I don't know whether that's affordable or not affordable. And most people who look at this question of take-up rates say, we don't understand why there are such low take-up rates. Nobody really has a very good answer. Insurance agents have some incentive to sell it, but they're not selling it. It's not happening very much. So nobody really knows the answer. Affordability could be part of it. My best answer to that is it's subsidized, and so it should be more affordable. And more affordable than homeowners.
One question for Dr. Moser Jones. Thank you so much for your presentation. I agree that the focus on racial and ethnic disparities and disaster outcomes has kind of unduly been on Hurricane Katrina, given the vast legacy of this disparities behind it. But given that it's got so much attention, do you feel like it changed kind of the public consciousness or discourse around structural inequality, institutional racism, and how that stuff becomes manifest in disasters? Or do you think that people didn't really, that wasn't the takeaway, even though it got so much media attention after the fact?
Well, what I think is, yes, that was the takeaway. And actually, I started studying this sort of social history of disasters right before Katrina, and after Katrina, I found it much easier to explain what I was doing. Because before Katrina, people were thinking of disasters in popular narratives, popular culture as more technological related. The risk is that you have an issue attention cycle, and it's something political scientists talk about. And that, so Katrina, there is a popular discussion of Katrina and structural inequalities and disaster and racism and disaster. And then as Katrina fades, I mean, we're more than 5 years out, right? So as Katrina fades in the popular imagination, this discussion sort of fades and becomes associated with the singularity of Katrina. And I think of 9/11 and Katrina as these two historical events of the 2000s, two historical, social disasters that become iconic, and they become singular, and they don't become something that people examine and think, oh, well, that could recur. Because they're so awful, right? They're so awful that you can say, well, you know, this doesn't apply here. This doesn't apply in Florida 2012 because we have different situations. So my attempt to bring in history is to sort of show that, guess what, these things recur, and, you know, it's not even just black-white issues. It's Chinese San Franciscans in the early 20th century. And I could have brought in Hurricane Camille if I had more time, which affected Virginia. And there were different issues, but racial, you know, complaints about racial disparities and disaster in Hurricane Camille in 1969. So, does that answer your
Yes.
question?
Could I follow up on that? Given what you have said and what I thought was an increase in consciousness of the country about racial disparity or racism for that matter on the basis of the Katrina experience, I'm curious about Jeffrey's point about what appears to have been a dearth of material in the publication world. Is that what you were saying? That there's So what's the extent of that disparity itself in terms of so Katrina was looked at in a disaster sense, and the racial dimension was not related by how much of a degree? What's the disparity between the general Katrina treatment and racism in Katrina?
Yeah, my impression is not scientific, but to give you an example, there's a congressional report about Katrina, right? A big congressional committee. It's a 300-page report. Doesn't talk about racism at all. It's not even mentioned. It's a non-issue. And the thing goes on and on and on about all these failures. It talks about the evacuation, talks about warnings, talks about FEMA, communication.
Who wrote it?
It's written by a congressional committee. It was a special task force of congressmen with their staff. So there were about a dozen congresspersons on the committee, and there were probably 50 staff involved in preparing the report. And it just doesn't mention it.
But politicians don't usually like to deal with racism. So that wouldn't surprise me in that report. But my impression had been that there was quite a lot of discussion of racism related to Katrina. So I'm surprised it didn't show up.
That was my impression as well, going in. And it may be because it, I think it's because for me, that the visual images were so moving and so stark that they have stayed with me. So when I think of Katrina, I think about racial issues. But it's in this very sort of nebulous way. And when I go out and start looking at the literature, like I looked at that database of pictures of Katrina, and there was a tag for race. And so there was a way for me to pull out just the pictures that dealt with Katrina and race. And that subset of pictures was not very interesting, not very helpful, and really quite small. I mean, it was like 24 pictures out of a database of thousands of AP pictures related to Katrina. And it to be fair, I mean, it had, pictures of congressmen and local politicians who were speaking, and maybe the president talking about the racial issue. But as I look at the database of work that was done visually by the AP photographers, the race piece was surprisingly small.
I think it has to do with a siloing in our national discussion about race and in general, and that, so I can think of a small number of social scientists who've written about Katrina, race, and disaster. The late Manning Marable, who came out with a biography, the new biography on Malcolm X, edited a volume on race and Katrina and disaster. There was another edited volume I reviewed on this issue. Susan Cutter and Greg Bankoff, two social scientists, she's a geographer, he's an anthropologist, wrote a series of articles about race and Katrina, and they study disaster in social context already. But it's a small subspecialty within, anthropology and geography and social geography. And they're probably, if we put them in the, context of American politics, left of center, and that they've already had conversations about what structural racism means. And I think in our overall popular culture discussions and in political discussions, we're not always speaking the same language. And so when we talk about racism, if you talked about it in the political arena, I mean, it's about personal, one-on-one, treating somebody badly individually.
I mean, I think it's interesting that the same disparity that we're talking about that leads to the disparities in how people get treated as a result of disasters is also reflected in the way it's reported because of who reports it and how it's reported. And the photographers, I'd like to know how many of them were even sensitive to that issue.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It also raises this interesting question for me about whether this is a disaster issue or a racial issue, and what the narrative should be about that. And I don't know part of the question is what it is, but part of the question is, what's going to be best for our evolution as a society to improve. And a lot of the structural things that I see that happen in places like Katrina have their roots in structural racism that exist completely independent of disasters. Right? So segregation in housing, access to insurance, whatever, those are things that are structural racial problems that we need to address. And the disaster might be a way of, creating some momentum about reform or some opportunity to speak about it, but it may not be that much of a disaster issue. It may be a racism issue, and maybe that's fine. Maybe that's okay. Or maybe it's siloing and it's ineffective. I don't know.
Or maybe it's both, right?
Yeah.
Because with the patterns of segregation, racial segregation are obviously deeply rooted, historically rooted. But the lack of protection by the levee, of the Lower Ninth Ward was directly disaster related and was related to this idea of structural racism, the lack of political will to fight for a larger protective wall that had to do with economic power and racism. And so it becomes so embedded and so hidden. And then the disaster narrative is about this, short-term thing that comes, this hazard of weather that just runs over people and and then disappears. And so it's really, I think there's this fundamental disconnect between these long-term patterns that become exposed in the disaster, and then the short-term narrative about the disaster, just coming through within a 24-hour period.
I mean, just one other observation. If you go to New Orleans today, it's a different city than before Katrina. The people who left have not returned. And it's really interesting to start looking at who's coming in their place and what industries are being taken over by whom and how. It's very quite fascinating. But that's another story.
I apologize, I came in a little late, but I was interested in whether you have thoughts or any information about what I believe is referred to as the Severe Repetitive Loss Properties Program, the Mitigated Properties Program within FEMA, as a setting where structural racism or class bias gets either perpetuated or perhaps sifted out from a flood.
I don't know the flood insurance program as well as I'd like. I do know that, so what you're referring to is there's this problem of a property being damaged by floods and then rebuilding it, having it damaged again by floods. And so there's this repetition that happens. And one of the problems with the flood insurance program is it doesn't have strong enough incentives to stop that because it's political rather than market-driven. And so there have been efforts to try to fix that and to try to improve that. And I don't really know what the current state of the law is about how that program works. And I don't have really any sense about its bearing on racial issues, though I expect that there would be some bearing I just don't know. I don't know what it would be. And part of the problem I had is difficulty in finding good data broken down by race for flood insurance. That data doesn't seem to be gathered. So there was a RAND study done, which is the best study of flood insurance take-up rates. It doesn't talk about race either. I mean, I was really surprised that social scientists at RAND wouldn't have gathered the information, and maybe it's in the database, and if I had access to the data, I could get it. But it wasn't in the report anywhere that told me what percentage of people who buy flood insurance are what race. I mean, it's just a very fundamental sort of social science data point that it wasn't there. So I don't know what the question would be as to the role of race in that kind of program, but it's a good question.
In the wake of a disaster, when you've lost everything, you're impoverished, and you can't afford a lawyer, how do you make sure that the insurance companies are giving you what you deserve?
That is a long-term problem with insurance as a vehicle. So the insurance companies say, well, we give you what you need. Well, you can trust us. You're in good hands with Allstate and all of that. And they do have some economic incentive that if their customers become too dissatisfied, they'll depart from that insurance and go to another insurance company. And the word will get out, and there are consumer organizations that monitor claims handling practices. And there are state regulators, right? So in Katrina, the insurance commissioners in Mississippi and in Louisiana were making a lot of noise and trying to get insurance companies to toe the line and cooperate. The reality is the insurance regulators have very little power, in my opinion. The real power comes from the threat of a lawsuit, and we have aggregation available through class actions. And so class action lawsuits are threatening, and the threat of bad faith damages or punitive damages. You may be aware of the State Farm case out of Utah, $135 million of punitive damages for a car accident case. That sort of judgment incentivizes insurance companies so that they act properly. And it does have an effect on behavior at the claims adjusting stage, that they are more careful at the claims adjusting stage because of being hit with punitive damages, or even if some competitors hit with punitive damages, it has an effect. There are statutory penalties that can come to bear that can make it a little easier to get a lawyer. So in about half the states, you can get your attorney's fees if the insurance company wrongfully withholds insurance payment. And so maybe a lawyer would be willing to take a small case on the theory that they could get the fees recovered. But the biggest problem is the amount at stake usually isn't enough. In a disaster like Katrina, I mean, I calculated that the average claim paid for homeowners was about $23,000 or $28,000. So there are a lot of big claims. Complete loss of a house is a big enough claim to get a lawyer to help you with. The problem is that in small loss, a hail situation where you have a $200 claim or a $5,000 claim, it's too expensive to get a lawyer. So that's a problem. What we really need is an ombudsman or mediation system alternative. So in some countries, there's an official person who's an ombudsperson you can take a complaint to, and they sort of make a few calls for you and try to mediate with the insurance company. But the problem is it's a government program, right? And so we're anti-government, autonomy-oriented, and one other big theme that I had thought about that Dad didn't talk about is this free market theme. Americans are big free market people around the world compared to, about the only place I think that competes with America is Hong Kong for being free market oriented. But we're way ahead, way out to the right of the rest of the world. And so the idea of having these government programs is difficult in America, culturally. Yes.
Kind of flowing from that question, in the wake of an event like Katrina, do you witness a lot of like a surge of pro bono and free indigent legal services that are provided? And is there a need for in communities, especially Gulf Coast, hurricane prone, earthquake prone communities? Is there a need for these services to be provided or to be available?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question that goes to race and poverty as well. So the whole issue of legal services for the poor is an issue that I don't think we have a very good answer to. And And the disasters, I think, suggest a greater need for it, but the temporary solutions are very poor. So I worked with a group of lawyers in Kansas City, and we wanted to volunteer to help out with the Joplin tornado disaster, right? And they told us in Joplin, do not come down here. We don't want your help because you're not really equipped to handle this community. That people have their own, they don't trust an outsider. Why should some lawyer from Kansas City help somebody in Joplin, Missouri? And how do they know whether it's a good lawyer, whether they know what they're talking about or not? What we need is an infrastructure through legal services that would actually support the poor, that could then handle an increase of work at the time that you had it. But the problem is they can't do the work that they have, and when they get a disaster, it doubles or triples the amount of work that they have, and then they have no capacity at all. So yeah, we need the help, but volunteer help is, at least my experience with Joplin was that it wasn't helpful, that they couldn't use it. And that was my experience in Kansas City when we had ice storms. I was trying to organize people to help with insurance, this issue over here, the insurance coverage issue, and we couldn't get it organized in a way that made sense for consumers.
You both talked a little bit about how these problems are sort of existing problems that are never sort of brought to light or exacerbated by the disaster. The levees being sort of the top of mind example of in disrepair, not upgraded, not ready to withstand a storm like Katrina. Do you think that's true for other disasters as well? The equivalent of the non-upgraded levees, the lack of attention paid to disaster preparedness? Do you think that has any sort of motivations based on socioeconomic status or lack of political power, or do you have any opinion?
Well, I think, historically, the American state has been reactive when it comes to whether it's regulating against any kind of danger, consumer dangers. It's very rare that we're actually proactive. Maybe the FDA is the only example where we're proactive, but even there you look at this long history of patent medicines and these horrible cases of poisoning and things. So, exactly. For example, in Florida, you have pre-Andrew housing and pre-Andrew zone regulations and post-Andrew. And so, I think we just, we fail to, we always are regulating against the last disaster. And then what happens is, so for example, in Florida, you have the pre-Andrew and post-Andrew. Well, who gets to move to post-Andrew housing? I don't have data on this, but my guess is that older housing that doesn't have the special hurricane windows is going to be less expensive, for example. It could be that, with Florida, you have the oceanfront housing being more expensive, but, there's always a socioeconomic gradient you have to look at with that, but I think just overall, we're so reactive.
Yeah, it's a very, very strong American tendency. If you compare, when I started this project, I started looking at the difference between Katrina and how the Japanese have handled the tsunami and the earthquake. And Japan is so different culturally in America when it comes to disasters. They have earthquake preparedness that's like over the top compared to what any American would do. And consequently, it really saved a lot of lives when they had the earthquake. Now, some people could say that that's geography, but I think it's largely cultural. And to me, it goes back to this notion of autonomy, that Americans want to act independently. We have a collective, yes, but we're not a collective, right? We're not the board. We are individuals, and the individual is paramount. It's so strong here that we can do anything, and we can overcome anything. We can beat all odds. So the dean's comment at the beginning that Americans pride themselves on helping out, that's exactly right. That's how we act. We react to the situation. We'll help you out. But the idea that you'll take my money as taxes to prepare for the future, that's not American. Right? I don't want that. I want to help when through volunteering or whatever. And that's this idea of freedom, of autonomy, of anti-government, and of the free market. Right? It's all very American, and it's historically true. We just do this over and over and over again. But it's something that is a strength as well. It's easy to talk about it as a weakness, here, but in terms of freedom and rights and discourse, I mean, the amount of discourse here, I mean, comparing us to China is ridiculous, right? Because we can talk about stuff in a way here that reflects our value for individual autonomy and freedom of speech, and that's a really good thing, but because of those same freedoms, we're not willing to invest in a lot of preventative stuff.
Also, I think, I mean, the other side is that we privilege commerce and commercial interests and freedom. You know, we don't want to burden business with too much regulation. And that's a strength in normal times, that businesses can operate here without, you know, suffering under, you know, suffocating under the weight of regulation. However, when it comes to disasters and disaster preparedness, you know,
The absence of the regulation means
it can,
a
yeah,
bigger disaster.
it can do that.
Stemming from just American want to be autonomous, it seems like you want to be autonomous, you want to have free choice whether you're getting insurance or not, but then when your house gets blown away by a hurricane, you want FEMA to come in and rebuild it. At that point, when that's happening, is the government then mandating that you have to get insurance? Or are they still letting you go off and be autonomous, even though you're in this disaster area and we've helped you rebuild your house, but then what happens?
I don't think the government mandates the insurance. And that's back to this problem that was mentioned before, which is, you know, we rebuild it, it gets blown over a second time, we rebuild it again. That's really inefficient. It's really a bad way to run things, to, you know, continue to build in these floodplains substandard housing that then gets blown over again. But it is a reflection of our notion of autonomy. And I'm not sure what the full explanation is of disaster relief, because our autonomy interest should say, well, you know, you made your bed, you got to sleep in it, right? And there's this sort of racial aspect to that too, where people say, well, you know, the Ninth Ward, they should have done something about it, they should have, you know, been more active politically, should have bought insurance, whatever. And so there is this kind of racial aspect to it as well. I think that the explanation is that our sympathies, our emotions go out to people who are victims. And we want to help the victims. But when they're not victims yet, when it's a contingent victim, we're not willing to help them. But when they're an actual victim, then we're willing to help them. I mean, 9/11 is just a really poignant example of that. The Victims' Compensation Fund is, you know, it's this socialist thing. I mean, it's really weird. And it's motivated both by patriotism, because you have the patriotism plus the victims. You overlay the two of those things, and you have this really potent political narrative that resulted in this really unique institution. We had Feinberg come and talk to our insurance group, and one of the questions was, is this a model for future things? He said, no, this will never happen again. But that's not true. It's going to happen again, right? So we have the oil spill compensation fund, which is a little bit like the Victims' Compensation Fund. So, you know, it's this reactive notion. But we have this sympathy. And the racial aspect, one of the things that I find really interesting is that as racism becomes a negative thing in American culture generally, it's used as a basis to reform. Whereas back in the 1920s, nobody really cared about being racist. It was not like, well, of course we're racist. What's the big deal? You know, there's no issue here. Now, to be racist is a bad thing. And so it is actually motivating reform. And it's a card or a lever or a narrative that's used to try to make progress.
Well, the American Red Cross back in the 20s did have this idea of humanity and neutrality. So they did, at a national level, still even back then, they didn't want to appear like they were treating African Americans as subhuman. So I think there still was a little bit of a nascent sort of narrative of racial equity. It just looked different than it wasn't.
It wasn't potent the way it is now.
Right.
The racial narrative is a strong narrative to use to get things done.
Right. But again, it's this disconnect between people think of racism as an individual thing, like I was individually denied insurance because someone looked at me and said, this is my skin color, versus when we talk about structural racism, it's not personal. It's an economic, it has economic underpinnings. It has to do with long-standing settlement patterns. It has legal roots with the racially restrictive covenants, forbidding people from living in certain neighborhoods that go back generations. And I think people just don't quite get that because it's hard to, maybe it's because of this individualism in our culture. We don't think of, so, maybe we need to come up with another word for this because, or to distinguish these two types of racism because it's such, it's such a volatile word that people become very defensive when it's talked about outside of academia. Structural inequality, if you want to call it. Or explain it to ordinary people in a different way, that is what we're talking about, we are talking about, yes, individuals being treated poorly, but mainly it's about this structural problem. I also wanted to say something that with regard to insurance, I wonder if it's, you have 46 million Americans living in poverty. And I know in Prince George's County, where I live, it's a very mixed income area. A lot of people who don't get car insurance because they need a car since it's not metro. A lot of things aren't metro accessible, but they're always juggling bills. So, this month I have to pay my mortgage or I have to pay my rent. I can't afford car insurance this month, and I'm going to just bet on not getting into an accident. So, I think, the discourse about social or economic inequality must play into that somehow.
Oh, absolutely. And the renting class is woefully underinsured, right? The reason why people who buy houses are insured is not because they buy insurance because they want it, they buy it because their lenders require them to. So it's a form of mandatory insurance. If you take mandatory insurance out of the equation, you look at just what people choose to buy, Americans are not that oriented towards insurance. The issue with poverty and affordability is certainly an important issue, but there are also values there that are significant and that complicate matters. So Americans live in a lot more space than people around the world, right? So what is an adequate amount of space for living? The standards are different here. And you could have smaller apartments. Now, some people, some immigrant communities or minority communities do have very crowded living environment compared to the average American, but some do not. And there's a question of what people spend their money on. I think Americans don't value spending their money on insurance, but they value spending it on other things. So, very common for me to see pretty sophisticated cell phones being used in poor communities. Right? It's an important value. That's what they spend money on.
It's also seen as necessary for communication, but it's again this idea of immediate needs versus the future and what may be possible. And I think, this is going to be another third rail I'll touch upon in addition to racism, but religion. A lot of people in this country, 87% of Americans identify as Christian. Religion teaches us that, we rely on the divine and so that things will work out. And so that this idea, I'm not saying that, most religious people don't get insurance, but there is some connection between that the idea of, being taken care of in some way, versus I have to take care of myself through insurance.
I agree.
Well, thank you so much for our panelists for an interesting discussion. We'll break for lunch now.